It was a quiet evening in the city, the kind of night when wealthy people often filled the finest restaurants. At one corner of the busy street stood a Michelin-starred restaurant, a place spoken about with admiration. The walls were lined with polished wood, the windows sparkled under golden lights, and the sound of clinking glasses floated out each time the heavy glass doors opened. It was a place where only the elite felt welcome, a place that seemed to shine with pride. Inside, the staff moved with practiced precision, their uniforms crisp, their smiles rehearsed. To many, it was not just a restaurant, it was a symbol of class. That evening, a woman walked slowly toward the doors. She was tall, graceful, and carried herself with a natural dignity. Her outfit was simple, a neat blouse and trousers, nothing extravagant, nothing to announce who she really was. Her jewelry was modest, her hair tied back neatly, and her steps calm. Few would have guessed that she was a billionaire, one of the most successful black women in business across the country. She had made her wealth through smart investments, technology ventures, and a lifetime of hard work. Yet she never felt the need to flaunt her riches. Tonight, she wanted only one thing: an evening of good food and peace. As she approached the reception, the restaurant manager noticed her. He was a tall man in a sharp suit, his eyes quick to scan anyone who entered. He had learned over the years to judge people at first glance, sometimes by their clothes, sometimes by their company, and sadly, sometimes by their skin. His smile was polished but thin, and when he looked at her, his expression shifted just slightly. He assumed she was out of place. "Good evening," she said with warmth, her voice polite, carrying a quiet confidence. "I'd like a table for one, please." The manager hesitated, glancing behind her as if expecting to see more people following. But no one came. He cleared his throat. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" She smiled gently. "No, I don't. But I thought I could be accommodated. I've heard so much about this restaurant." His eyes flickered, and a small, dismissive smile appeared. "Unfortunately, we are fully booked tonight. No tables available, I'm afraid." The woman looked around. Through the glass doors leading into the dining hall, she could see at least 4 empty tables, each neatly set with silverware, waiting for guests who had not yet arrived. She knew well enough how this worked. She had dined in the finest places across the world. A Michelin-starred restaurant never turned away someone politely if there was space, especially when they carried themselves with dignity. Yet she did not argue. She simply nodded. "I see," she said softly. "Are you sure?" "I don't mind waiting." The manager's tone hardened, though still covered in politeness. "I'm sorry. As I said, we are fully committed tonight. Perhaps you could try another place. There are some restaurants down the street that might suit better." The words hung in the air. Suit better. It was a phrase that carried more weight than the manager realized. She caught the meaning. He had judged her not by her manners, not by her words, but by something else entirely. A couple standing nearby, waiting to be seated, shifted uncomfortably, noticing the exchange. They, too, had seen the empty tables. But the manager carried on as if nothing was unusual. She held his gaze for a moment, her eyes calm, steady, and unreadable. She could have revealed herself right there, told him her name, her reputation, her wealth. She could have demanded respect. But she did not. Instead, she gave him a faint smile, one that revealed nothing of what she was truly feeling inside. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice steady. "I'll take my leave then." She turned and walked out slowly, her posture upright, her dignity intact. The golden lights of the restaurant reflected against the glass doors as they closed behind her. Outside, the cool air touched her face, and for a brief moment, her heart ached, not because she needed the food, not because she needed the experience, but because once again, she had been judged unfairly. Despite all her success, despite her billions, she was still seen by some as someone who did not belong. She walked down the street, the city lights glowing against the night sky. In her mind, she replayed the manager's words, his dismissive tone, his subtle smile. She had faced harder challenges in life: business rivals, failed deals, moments of doubt. But personal insults cut differently. They reminded her of where she came from, of the many times in her younger years when doors had been closed simply because she didn't fit an image in someone else's mind. Yet she was not bitter. She had learned long ago to let such things fuel her strength, not weaken it. As she moved farther away from the restaurant, she pulled out her phone. A message blinked on the screen from a friend, asking if she had reached the place safely. She typed back a short reply, "All fine. Headed home instead." She smiled faintly as she sent it, knowing her friend would not suspect the truth of what had just happened. Meanwhile, inside the restaurant, the manager straightened his suit, feeling proud of himself for protecting the reputation of his establishment. He whispered to a hostess, "Some people just don't belong here. You have to keep the brand clean." The hostess said nothing, though her eyes showed unease. She had recognized the woman, though she could not be completely sure. She had seen her face once on the cover of a financial magazine. But fear of her manager's authority kept her silent. Other diners, too, exchanged glances. Some shook their heads quietly, while others pretended not to notice. The clinking of glasses, the laughter of wealthy guests, and the soft music soon drowned out the memory of what had just occurred. To the staff, it was just another night, another guest turned away. But for those who truly observed, it was a moment of shame that hung heavy in the air. The woman returned to her home that evening, her large glass windows overlooking the city skyline. She poured herself a glass of water and sat quietly, thinking. Around her, the house was filled with signs of her success: art collected from around the world, books on business and culture, awards for her achievements. Yet at that moment, none of it seemed to matter. She had been treated like she was invisible. She had been reminded that some people judged worth not by actions or achievements, but by shallow assumptions. But unlike many who might have carried the pain silently, she was a woman of action. Her mind was sharp, her instincts keen, and her resources vast. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Slowly, an idea began to take shape. If the manager and the restaurant saw her as someone unworthy of a seat at their table, perhaps it was time to change the table altogether. Not with anger, not with noise, but with power, with grace, and with the kind of strength that came only from knowing who you truly were. The night was quiet around her, the city humming softly in the distance. She sipped her water again, calm and composed. On the surface, it looked like she had simply accepted rejection. But deep inside, a silent fire had been lit. The story was only beginning. The next morning, the city woke up as usual, with traffic moving fast, offices filling up, and news outlets buzzing about politics, celebrities, and business deals. But somewhere in small corners of social media, whispers began to form. The incident at the Michelin-Starred restaurant had not gone completely unnoticed. A young couple who had been seated near the entrance the night before had seen the entire exchange. The woman had taken a discreet photo of the billionaire as she walked out, and later, she shared it online with a short caption, "Unbelievable." They turned away a powerful woman, and the restaurant had empty tables. Some things never change. At first, the post drew only a few comments, people expressing their shock or brushing it off as just another example of arrogance in fine dining. But as hours passed, the post began to spread. Others chimed in, sharing their own experiences of being treated coldly or dismissed unfairly in high-end places. Slowly, the focus shifted. Some people recognized the woman in the photo. They had seen her face in business magazines, on the covers of financial newspapers, in interviews where she was celebrated as one of the most successful entrepreneurs of her time. The comments multiplied. "Wait a second, isn't she the billionaire investor?" one person wrote. Another added, yes, she owns half the tech startups in the valley. That restaurant has no idea who they messed with. By afternoon, the story had grown legs. Lifestyle bloggers picked it up, framing it as a tale of ignorance and arrogance. When status blinds you to true power, one article wrote. Business influencers reposted the photo, reminding their followers that money and class don't always wear designer labels. And yet, through all the noise, the woman herself remained silent. She posted nothing, said nothing, and carried on with her usual day. Those close to her knew this was not because she was weak, but because she was calculating. She had always believed that the strongest answers were not spoken in words but in actions. Meanwhile, inside the restaurant, life carried on as if nothing had happened. The manager stood near the reception again that evening, greeting guests with the same polished smile. When one of the younger waiters cautiously mentioned that people online were talking about a guest being turned away the previous night, the manager waved his hand dismissively. Social media is full of nonsense, he said, adjusting his tie. People exaggerate. Our brand is untouchable. One small incident will not harm us. His confidence sounded strong, but deep inside, there was a flicker of unease he did not admit to anyone. What he didn't know was that the woman he had rejected was already moving silently behind the scenes. That night, after returning home, she sat at her desk and opened her laptop. On the screen were documents, business reports, and financial charts. She searched for the restaurant's ownership details, the company that controlled it, and its shareholders. Her fingers moved quickly, typing in names, tracing connections. Years of experience had made her an expert at spotting weaknesses, and soon, she found them. The restaurant, despite its glowing reputation, had financial cracks beneath the surface. The pandemic years had left a dent. Expansion costs had stretched them thin. Behind the polished service and golden lights, they were carrying a debt larger than most people would guess. She leaned back in her chair, a small, thoughtful smile touching her lips. She knew exactly what this meant. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need to embarrass anyone. What she wanted was something far more powerful: control. And control could be gained through ownership. She closed the laptop softly and sipped her tea. The plan was forming in her mind, and she would not rush it. Timing, she knew, was everything. As days passed, the whispers online grew louder. Some newspapers picked up the story, though carefully, never naming the woman directly. They called her a mystery guest or a powerful businesswoman, but people who knew recognized her immediately. Behind closed doors, elite circles murmured in shock. At charity dinners, at board meetings, even at golf clubs, people whispered, "Did you hear what happened?" They actually refused her. Many shook their heads in disbelief. Some laughed quietly at the foolishness of the restaurant. And a few began to wonder if there would be consequences. The woman herself carried on with her daily life. She attended meetings, signed new deals, and kept her usual calm routine. But in the quiet hours of evening, she met with advisors, investment managers, and lawyers. They gathered around her polished oak table, where she laid out her thoughts clearly. "I don't want drama. I don't want noise. I want results. This restaurant believes it decides who belongs and who doesn't. That is a mistake. If they think I don't belong at their table, then perhaps it's time I own the table itself." Her words were measured, her tone calm, but her eyes carried the fire of determination. The advisors nodded. They had seen her rise from small beginnings to one of the most respected figures in business. They knew she did not speak without purpose. Quietly, preparations began. Financial offers were discussed, inquiries were made discreetly, and strategies were drawn. She was careful. She didn't want her identity revealed too soon. If the owners of the restaurant realized who was behind the sudden interest, they might resist. But cloaked behind layers of trusted partners and holding companies, she began to set the stage. In the restaurant, however, ignorance continued to reign. The staff whispered among themselves, some still uneasy about the night of the rejection. A few waiters admitted privately that they had recognized the guest. "She's on the list of the 50 richest women," one whispered. But the manager laughed off their concerns. "Do you think a billionaire would come alone, dressed so simply, without security, without assistance? Impossible. You people imagine too much." He carried on proudly, still blind to the storm building around him. The days turned into weeks, and the story slowly settled into the background. Other news took over headlines, and social media moved on to new dramas. But in business circles, the memory lingered. The woman had still said nothing, and her silence puzzled some. Was she ignoring it? Was she too hurt to respond? Or was she planning something larger? Those who knew her best suspected the last. And indeed, behind closed doors, the plan was advancing. She had gathered every detail she needed. The restaurant's financial struggles, the shareholders' frustrations, and the investors' quiet desire for a buyer who could secure the future. The woman's advisors had already spoken to some of them, presenting offers too attractive to ignore. Piece by piece, the foundation was being laid. But the outside world remained unaware. To them, it seemed like the story had ended with a quiet rejection and a billionaire's silent dignity. No one knew that the real story was only beginning. For the woman who had been dismissed so casually at the door was not someone who carried pain without turning it into power. She had faced greater battles in life and won. This would be no different. On one late evening, as she looked out of her window at the glowing city, she thought back to the moment when the manager had told her the restaurant was fully booked. The memory no longer stung. Instead, it made her smile. She whispered softly to herself, "We'll see who has no table." And with that, she closed her eyes and rested, ready for the next step. The whispers outside would continue for a while. The curiosity would grow. But the real surprise was yet to come. For soon, the very place that turned her away would open its doors to her not as a guest, not as someone hoping for a seat, but as the rightful owner. And when that moment arrived, the city would remember her silence not as weakness, but as the quiet before a storm. Weeks passed after the incident, and the restaurant carried on with its glittering evenings, welcoming famous guests, business leaders, and tourists who had read about its Michelin stars. The staff polished wine glasses, folded napkins with care, and served dishes that looked more like art than food. From the outside, everything appeared perfect, but beneath the shine, the cracks were still there. Financial pressures weighed on the owners, though they worked hard to keep it hidden. The woman who had been rejected that night had not forgotten the experience, though she carried it with calmness instead of anger. She had always believed that real power was not in loud words but in quiet action. She continued her business meetings and daily life as usual, but in private, she was focused on something else: the restaurant that thought she did not belong. Through her advisors, she began moving quietly. A lawyer she trusted reached out to one of the smaller shareholders of the restaurant group, presenting what looked like a simple investment inquiry. The shareholder, tired of slow returns and concerned about growing costs, listened carefully. The offer was generous, more than what he expected. Within weeks, she acquired his stake without anyone knowing her name was behind it. One small piece was in place. Her next move was with an overseas investor who had quietly been looking to exit. The restaurant's prestige was high, but its profits were inconsistent, and the investor preferred stable ventures. Again, through a trusted partner, the woman extended an offer. It was neat, elegant, and hard to refuse. Soon, she controlled another significant piece of the puzzle. Step by step, her influence grew, though no one at the restaurant noticed. The manager still stood proudly at the reception, telling his staff stories about important guests he had served. He still believed he had done the right thing that night by refusing service to a woman he thought did not belong. He was unaware that the very foundation of the place he served was slowly shifting beneath him. The woman knew timing was everything. She never rushed, never revealed her hand too soon. At her home office, she spread out documents across her large desk, analyzing ownership charts, debt structures, and board member interests. She read carefully, marking notes in neat handwriting. She knew each shareholder's weakness. Some wanted quick cash, others wanted out of the food business altogether. And she used those insights wisely. Her advisors admired her focus. One evening, one of them asked softly, "Do you really want to own this place? You have bigger ventures, larger companies. Why bother with a single restaurant, even if it is Michelin-Starred?" She looked at him calmly, her eyes steady. "It's not about the food. It's about respect. It's about showing that no one decides who belongs at the table except the person who owns it. They thought I was unworthy. Soon, they will realize who was truly in control all along." Her words carried no bitterness, only strength. That was who she was. Months passed, and finally, the moment came when she acquired the last major piece she needed. A group of investors, facing pressure from debts, agreed to sell their shares. With that deal, she held the majority. She was now the controlling owner of the Michelin-Starred restaurant that had once shut its doors in her face. She did not announce it right away. She allowed the paperwork to settle, the lawyers to finalize contracts, and the ownership to shift quietly. The restaurant's old owners, relieved to have financial security, moved on to other ventures. They never suspected who was truly behind the deal. To them, it was just another wealthy investor with interest in fine dining. Inside the restaurant, life went on unchanged. The chefs still crafted delicate dishes, the waiters still carried plates with care, and the guests still walked out praising the experience. The manager still spoke with arrogance, unaware that his boss had changed. He treated staff the same way he always had, enforcing rules strictly, never realizing that someone new was watching from the shadows. The woman chose not to visit immediately. She wanted the reveal to be perfect. Instead, she watched quietly as the restaurant operated under her ownership. She received reports from her advisors about profits, staff behavior, and guest experiences. She read them carefully, making plans for changes she would implement once her presence was revealed. Her silence puzzled many who had followed the earlier incident. People still whispered in business circles about what might have happened after the rejection. Some thought she had simply walked away and forgotten. Others guessed she was waiting for the right time to respond. Only a few, those who knew her well, suspected the truth that she was already in control. At a board meeting held in a sleek glass office downtown, she finally appeared. The room went silent when she walked in. Some of the remaining shareholders looked at her with surprise, realizing too late who had been buying up their shares. With calm grace, she introduced herself not as an outsider but as the new majority owner. "This restaurant," she said softly, "has great potential. But it must represent more than just food. It must represent fairness, dignity, and respect for every guest who walks through the door." No one dared to object. Her wealth, her influence, and her sharp business record spoke louder than any argument. The meeting ended with her firmly established as the leader. That night, she sat by her window again, looking out over the glowing city. Her plan was complete. The restaurant that once told her there was no table now belonged to her. Yet she felt no urge for revenge. She was not planning to humiliate anyone. What she wanted was to teach a lesson, not just to the manager who dismissed her, but to everyone who believed power could be judged by appearance. The time for the reveal was coming closer. She imagined walking through those glass doors again, but this time not as a guest, not as someone turned away, but as the rightful owner. She imagined the look on the manager's face when he realized who she truly was. And more than that, she imagined the future of the restaurant, one where no guest would ever be judged unfairly again. For now, she waited patiently. The quiet acquisition was complete. The stage was set. Soon, the world would see the truth. The evening was cool and clear, the city shining with its usual golden lights as cars streamed through the busy streets. Outside the Michelin-starred restaurant, the same golden glow poured from the windows, inviting the elite and the curious alike. The place looked as it always had: polished glass doors, soft music playing inside, and staff standing tall in their uniforms, ready to greet the night's guests. For the manager, it was just another evening, another chance to display what he thought was the charm of exclusivity. He had no idea that tonight would be different, that tonight the very ground beneath him would shift. She arrived without rush, stepping out of a sleek black car that stopped quietly in front of the entrance. This time, she was not alone. With her walked a small group of trusted advisors, lawyers, and a few journalists invited under a confidential notice. She had chosen this night carefully, not only because the restaurant was full but because it would have the right audience. Business leaders, celebrities, and critics were dining inside. The perfect stage. The manager, standing at the reception, saw her enter. He did not recognize her at first. To him, she was just another well-dressed woman, perhaps someone's important guest. She wore a tailored black dress with a subtle shine, elegant but not flashy, paired with simple pearl earrings. Her posture was graceful, and her steps were measured. For a moment, he felt a sense of familiarity but brushed it away. "Good evening, madam," he said with his usual practiced smile. "Do you have a reservation tonight?" She looked at him calmly, the faintest trace of a smile touching her lips. "No reservation," she replied softly. "But I think I'll be staying anyway." The manager blinked, slightly taken aback. He adjusted his tie. "I'm afraid that will not be possible," he said quickly, his tone carrying the same edge as it had weeks before. "We are fully booked tonight, as always." Before he could continue, one of her lawyers stepped forward, holding a sleek black folder. "Actually," the lawyer said clearly, his voice firm enough for nearby diners to hear, "this lady is the rightful owner of this restaurant. As of last month, she holds the controlling shares of the entire company. She does not need a reservation. She owns the very tables you speak of." The words struck like a sudden silence in the room. Staff members paused in mid-step, waiters holding trays froze, and diners turned their heads curiously. The manager's confident smile faltered, his face paling as he looked from the lawyer back to the woman. She stepped forward gently, her eyes steady on his. "Do you remember me?" she asked softly. "A few weeks ago, I walked in, simply dressed, asking for a table. You looked at me and told me there was no space. You told me, perhaps, I would find a place that suited me better. That was your judgment." The manager's mouth opened, then closed, his words lost. Beads of sweat appeared at his temples. His polished confidence crumbled. He tried to speak. I didn't know." She raised a hand lightly, stopping him without anger, only grace. "That's right. You didn't know. And that is the point. You judged without knowing. You believed power wore a certain dress, a certain color, or walked with a certain company. But power, respect, and worth are not measured by appearance. They are measured by character." The room was silent except for the faint sound of music playing in the background. Diners stared, some with wide eyes, some with quiet admiration. A few even took out their phones discreetly, recording what they understood was a moment no one would soon forget. She turned to the gathered staff and guests. "I am not here to embarrass anyone," she said gently, her voice carrying across the polished hall. "I am here to make something clear. This restaurant will no longer be a place where people are judged by how they look or where they come from. Every guest who walks through these doors will be treated with dignity. Because dignity does not belong to one group, it belongs to every human being." Her words were calm, yet powerful, and they touched more than just the staff. Many diners nodded quietly, moved by her composure and truth. Some whispered to each other, realizing the weight of the moment. The journalists present scribbled notes, their pens racing across paper, already imagining the headlines that would appear by morning. The manager stood frozen, shame washing over him. His earlier arrogance now felt like a heavy stone pressing on his chest. He had thought himself the guardian of class and exclusivity. Yet here he stood, exposed, his judgment shallow and his pride meaningless. One of the waiters, a young man who had seen the incident weeks ago, stepped forward nervously. "Madam," he said softly, his voice trembling but respectful, "I remember that night. I wanted to speak up, but I was afraid. I'm sorry for what happened." She turned to him, her eyes kind. "Do not be sorry for being afraid. Be sorry only if you do not learn. Courage grows with time, and tonight is a chance for everyone here to learn." She then walked gracefully through the restaurant, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Every eye followed her. She paused near one of the empty tables, the very kind she had been told did not exist weeks earlier. She rested her hand lightly on the back of a chair. "This table is mine now," she said with a gentle smile. "And so is every other table here. But more importantly, it belongs to anyone who enters with respect in their heart." The journalists scribbled faster, their faces glowing with the realization of the story unfolding before them. The diners whispered words of admiration, and even applause began to build slowly, softly, until the room was filled with clapping. Not loud, not forced, but genuine, a recognition of grace and strength. The manager could not move. His career flashed before his eyes, and with it, the realization that one moment of arrogance had changed everything. He wanted to beg for forgiveness, but the dignity in her eyes told him this was not the time. Forgiveness, if it came, would come not through words but through action. She looked at him one last time before sitting down. "You will have a chance to prove yourself," she said quietly. "Whether you stay here or move on is up to you. But understand this: the days of judgment without reason are over." As she sat, her advisors and guests joined her, and waiters rushed nervously but respectfully to serve. The atmosphere was charged with awe. The diners felt they were part of history. The restaurant, once a place of silent exclusion, had just become the stage for one of the most powerful lessons in humility. That night, the story spread faster than anyone could imagine. By morning, headlines appeared across news outlets: "Billionaire returns as owner to restaurant that rejected her, grace and power redefine fine dining." The night a lesson was served at a Michelin-Starred hall. For the city, it was more than a story about business. It was a story about dignity, respect, and the quiet strength of a woman who chose not to fight with anger but with wisdom. The restaurant, once known only for its food, would now be remembered for the night its new owner walked in and turned rejection into revelation. The night of her reveal had shaken the restaurant like a quiet earthquake. Guests left whispering in amazement, some still stunned that the woman they had once seen turned away was now the owner of the most famous Michelin-starred place in the city. The journalists published their reports before the sun came up, and by morning, the story had spread everywhere. Newspapers, blogs, and television programs carried the headlines. The photographs showed her standing tall in the middle of the restaurant, calm and composed, while the manager stood behind her, pale and humbled. People who read the story felt a mix of shock, admiration, and respect. Many called it a lesson in patience and dignity, something the world needed to be reminded of. The woman herself, however, woke up the next day not with excitement, but with focus. For her, ownership was not just about making a point. It was about responsibility. She had taken over the restaurant not only to prove something but also to create change. As she sat at her breakfast table, sunlight pouring through the wide windows of her home, she reviewed the first set of reports sent by her advisors. Staff salaries, training budgets, customer satisfaction, all the things that had been ignored under the old owners were now placed neatly before her. She read carefully, sipping her tea, and began making notes in her calm, steady handwriting. Her first decision was about the staff. She called a meeting at the restaurant later that week. Every employee, from the chefs in the kitchen to the servers on the floor, gathered in the dining hall. The chandeliers sparkled above them, but the mood was tense. Many of the younger waiters were nervous, afraid they might be punished for what had happened weeks earlier. The manager stood stiffly, unsure whether he would even have a job by the end of the day. When she entered, silence filled the room. She walked with the same quiet grace she always carried, her expression warm but serious. She looked at the staff for a long moment before speaking. "I know many of you are wondering why you are here today. Some of you are afraid, and I understand that. But let me make one thing clear. I did not come here to remove everyone or to throw people away. I came here to build something stronger." She paused, letting her words settle. Faces around the room slowly relaxed, though the manager still looked uneasy. She continued. "The night I was refused entry here, I felt the weight of unfair judgment. But I do not believe that one person's mistake should define all of you. I believe in growth. I believe in learning. And I believe in creating a culture where every guest, no matter how they look, no matter where they come from, is treated with equal respect." The staff listened, their eyes wide. Many of them had never heard an owner speak in such a personal way. She outlined her plans clearly. There would be new training programs focused not only on service but also on dignity and inclusion. Staff would be encouraged to treat every guest as though they were the most important person in the room. Because, she said, in truth, every guest is important. Whether they wear pearls or plain cotton, whether they drive a sports car or walk in on foot, they are all worthy of respect. Then she turned her gaze to the manager. The room seemed to hold its breath. He shifted uncomfortably under her eyes. Finally, she spoke. "As for you, I will not fire you today. Not because you deserve to stay, but because I believe you should face the results of your own choices. You will be demoted. You will no longer manage this restaurant. Instead, you will work under supervision, learning again what it means to serve with humility. If you cannot learn, then your time here will end." His face turned red, but he nodded silently. He knew arguing would only deepen his shame. With that, she ended the meeting. The staff left murmuring among themselves, surprised by her fairness. They had expected anger, maybe even mass firings, but instead they found leadership. The younger waiters admired her. The chefs respected her calm authority. For the first time, they felt hopeful that the restaurant might become more than a place of polished walls and fine plates. It might become a place of true hospitality. Word of her decisions spread quickly. Customers who read about the changes grew even more interested in dining there. Reservations filled faster than ever, not only because of the food but because people wanted to experience the new spirit of the place. Guests arrived expecting not just a meal but also respect, warmth, and dignity. And the staff, motivated by her example, delivered it. Slowly, the reputation of the restaurant grew beyond Michelin stars. It became known as the restaurant where everyone belonged. For her, the success was not measured in profits, though the numbers soon rose higher than before. It was measured in the smiles of guests, the confidence of her staff, and the messages she received from people across the world who read her story. Letters and emails poured in, people thanking her for showing grace in the face of disrespect, young entrepreneurs saying her actions gave them courage, and ordinary diners sharing their own experiences of being judged unfairly. She read many of them late at night, sitting by her window with a calm smile. The city, too, learned something from the story. Newspapers wrote not only about her wealth but about her patience. Talk shows discussed how power does not need to shout to be heard. Schools even used the story as an example in discussions about dignity and respect. The once arrogant restaurant now stood as a living reminder that humility and fairness could bring more prestige than arrogance ever could. Months later, she walked into the restaurant again, this time not for a grand reveal, but simply to enjoy a meal. She chose a quiet corner table, ordered her food, and sat watching the life of the place unfold. Guests laughed softly, waiters moved confidently, and the manager, now in his lower role, worked quietly without his old arrogance. She felt no anger toward him anymore. Instead, she felt a calm sense of closure. Her plate arrived, beautifully prepared, and she smiled. For a moment, she thought back to the night when she had been told there were no tables available. She thought of the quiet walk she had taken that night, her heart heavy yet determined. And she thought of the long journey that had brought her here, not just to ownership, but to change. She whispered to herself, almost like a reflection, "This is not about me. It's about everyone who has ever been told they don't belong. Tonight, they belong." She lifted her fork, took a bite, and felt peace. The restaurant glowed under the chandeliers, alive with voices and warmth. It was no longer a place of silent exclusion but of shared dignity. And as she dined quietly, she knew her lesson had been delivered not through punishment, not through anger, but through grace, patience, and the steady hand of a woman who understood that true power is shown in how you treat others. And so the story that began with rejection ended with transformation. The restaurant thrived, the staff learned, the guests felt welcome, and the world was reminded of a simple truth: respect costs nothing, but it changes everything.